do you have some sort of blocked out time in the mornings to do research? Or I guess I should say, like, at any time during the day where you go, okay, here, at least X number of times per week, I have this blocked out period of time to do research.
That's a great question. And the answer is no. So my husband and I, and we're both professors of philosophy. We work at the same school, and we both managed to get plenty of writing and research done. But our lives are really not structured. Really, I mean, we have a 2.5 year old and a 9 month old, and so for us right now, it's kind of just like we have just sort of set agreement where, for an hour or two a day, it's like, all right, you've got the kids because I got to go write. But that hour might be in the morning, it might be at night, it might be in the middle of the day. Uh, and that's just kind of how things are right now. Probably when they're older, it will get more structured like that. But right now, we just sort of wing it.
Yeah, and I can completely relate to that. So I want to get more into family life as an academic. Maybe before we go there, I want to hear a little bit about your background. And I'm curious, I ask this of most guests, but do you remember a time when it sort of clicked for you that you went, oh, I maybe naturally think about things a little bit more deeply? Maybe that was an understanding of philosophy as a field, or maybe just sort of big questions, and that went into the field and an interest in pursuing it academically. So, in your mind, like, how did that start in your own biography?
Yeah, so I definitely remember that time. So I think probably a lot of philosophers. I grew up in the church. I grew up as a youth group kid, and when I was in high school, I when I was 14, I remember suddenly just having all of these questions about, I guess, like theological questions, philosophical theological questions, and there were like a lot of them, and I would sort of ask my youth pastor like you do, and and he was great because I remember him being like, I have no idea, but I have this friend actually. He also goes to church here, and he is a graduate student in philosophy at Notre Dame. We lived right across the border from South Bend, Indiana at the time, so there's a lot of Notre Dame people around. Um, and uh, he's like, you guys should talk. And this guy who is still, we're still friends, good friends to this day. He was my mentor all through college and grad school. He was really ambitious, and he's like, you know what? You know what you need to read? And he gave me Pascal's Pensées and Augustine's Confessions. And he's like, you need to read these. So I did. And I loved them. And just a couple years after that, when I was 16, I was also homeschooled. And something that a lot of homeschoolers do is they do dual enrollment courses. So when you're in high school, you can take some college courses at local schools and get dual enrollment credits. So I was like, you know what? What the heck? I'll take Intro to Philosophy. And it was to my 16-year-old mind, I was like, this is the best time I've ever had doing anything. This is what I want to do. And that's kind of when I decided.
That seems really early on. I mean, I had, I kind of always thought philosophically on some level and didn't know it up until a certain point. But to me, that seems kind of on the early side, especially 14, grabbing those sorts of historical books. I mean, what you had to have understood some of that to prep you for later on. And even at 16, that seems like a lot to handle. So it's just something that just naturally clicked for you. I guess you had some sort of mentorship too, but like, I mean, that speaks well of you, but I don't guess that that's like a common story.
Yeah, being homeschooled, I know people have a lot of different experiences with it. Some people have really bad experiences with it, which I totally respect. But we had a really good experience with it. My parents were super dedicated, and we also had a lot of free time to kind of do the things that we liked, which for me was just reading. So I read and read and read all the time. All Basically all my. I actually read so much that I gave myself a neck injury. That might be a little too much, but I think just sort of being immersed in books for pretty much my whole life kind of set me up for being able to read more difficult material earlier on. And then also just having people in my life who would kind of push me to do that.
Yeah. Was there, do you remember like a branch that you naturally gravitated towards? Were you super interested in either like metaphysics, epistemology, or was it philosophy or religion, I guess, that's, or how did you think about that? Were those divisions even like present in your mind at that point?
Um, so philosophy of religion questions is what initially got me interested. The class that I took, the university class that I took when I was 16, pretty much the whole thing was going through Plato's Republic, which I guess your podcast is selling Plato, so I'm going to do that right now. It's still my favorite work to this day. I still think you can't really beat it. So definitely metaphysics, although pretty early on into my degree, I started to get interested in ethics. Um, and, I've kind of come around more to preferring metaphysics now again.
Okay, awesome. That's, I mean, personally, that's what I specialize in, and that's kind of where my mind gravitates towards. So, two follow-up questions on that. Like, what was it about Plato's Republic that grabbed you, number one? And then number two, how has that interest veered into metaphysics now?
So I think what grabbed me most about Plato's Republic was sort of the big metaphysical picture of the good that Plato uses the book to show readers. Um, I was drawn by it then, and I still am. I'm still a Platonist. Um, and but how the book is done was really interesting to me. You always see these takes like, oh, why do we revere the older philosophers so much? Look at all these terrible arguments, and invariably they'll try to formalize some arguments from the Republic, and they're like, look how bad this is, and it's like, right, that's true. But I think pretty clearly how Plato is going about um, giving us the picture he wants to give us by the end of the book isn't through the individual arguments that people are making, but kind of in a really indirect kind of way. And that way of doing philosophy was really appealing to me then. It still is. I'm still drawn to thinkers who work that way, like Kierkegaard, like Wittgenstein. To me, it's more persuasive than direct argumentation, and you can argue for a lot more, I think.
Yeah, do you have a chance to assign that in any of your classes?
You know, the only Plato I've ever been able to teach thus far is the Apology of Socrates, which is great. But I haven't had the opportunity to teach much more of that. I did get to teach a class once called 20th Century Moral Theory, where we did read some Wittgenstein. That was a great experience because me assigning Wittgenstein in that class was really, I was very nervous about it. It was an undergrad class. I was really nervous that they would hate it. It wouldn't land well. It wouldn't make sense. And they totally crushed it. So that was great. And Kierkegaard, I have taught Kierkegaard. I teach a 19th century philosophy class. But I do have mixed feelings about teaching Kierkegaard, and that is because he was an extremely systematic thinker. And a lot of times when you assign a single work of his outside of the broader context of like his entire first authorship or his entire second authorship, it's really easy to miss exactly what he's doing. Sometimes in really big ways. I had a friend in grad school who said uh, somebody assigned parts of Fear and Trembling in a survey class she took once, and she came away from that experience convinced that Kierkegaard must have been an atheist because it must be like a parody argument because what a ridiculous kind of argument to make, which totally makes sense if you don't understand his entire kind of pseudonymous project. So I do teach some Kierkegaard. I rarely teach the pseudonymous work in survey classes because of that.
Yeah, don't you have an article somewhere that makes the case that you shouldn't teach kicker? So, like, have you changed position? I know I'm jumping around a little bit, but have you changed positions on that? And I'm interested. What was the sort of thrust of writing that? Did it come out of that experience?
It came out of the experience of talking to my friend in grad school, and just sort of being irritated at a lot of people's hot takes on Fear and Trembling. You'll see Kierkegaard classified as a fideist a lot of places. I think that's really wrong. But I get why someone would think that if they'd only read that book. And so it came out of frustration with interpretation quite a bit. Have I changed my position? Not really. I'm just kind of a hypocrite. And also, in a 19th century philosophy class, you pretty much have to teach him, or else you're going to get some weird looks. But I do try to keep it as short as possible and stick to the works that are more standalone than others.
Yeah, okay, good. And I'm earmarking this. I want to talk about pedagogy at some point too, but I'm interested. So you went from diving into some pretty deep philosophy at a young age. And so was that part of the motivation for you majoring in the field, or what really motivated you to concentrate on this field in particular?
Yeah, I think pretty much from that first class, what I thought I really wanted to do was teach. In part because the professor I had was so wonderful, Christian Mihut, who's at Bethel in South Bend, Indiana. He was great, still is great. I'm pretty sure he's still teaching. And so I was like, yeah, this is what I want to do. I want to be the proverbial midwife for all these students experiencing philosophical thinking for the first time. But I will say, so I double majored. I did philosophy and I did creative writing, which was the other thing that I really wanted to do. I really wanted to write fiction. And for a while, I did kind of struggle with, should I do grad school for philosophy? Should I try to go get an MFA? I am glad I made the choice that I did. So I'll say, I think it would have been much harder to make it into something that I could pour my life into if I was trying to hack it just with writing. At least for me, who I think is not as skilled in that sort of writing as maybe I wish I would have been.
Do you have a sense of what the job market is like for creative writing compared to philosophy?
No, I don't. I think probably for the kind of writing I would have wanted to do, which would have been like literary fiction, I'm sure it's just awful. If you can really like find a groove with genre fiction, you're probably better off. Um, but yeah, I really don't know.
Yeah, me neither. I know philosophy is horrible, but I can imagine that the creative writing job market is not that great either.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, good. So you were sort of on board in college. There was motivation from, witnessing what a good professor looks like at the college level. And do you remember the process? Did you jump right into grad school after that? Or what was the process like of going, okay, I did the college thing. Looks like I need to go on. So what was that decision making process like?
In college, I actually took a long time. I was in college for 5 years because I had to work part time to pay for books and the stuff that my loans didn't cover and food, stuff like that. So I did have to work a little bit, and like I said, I also did go back and forth on the philosophy and creative writing thing. So I was doing my undergrad for like 5 years. And then I actually took a gap year to work um, really full time, like 70 hours a week, because I needed to save up money because, as you know, grad school applications are not free. Um, so I needed to save up money for that. So I took a gap year, worked a lot, saved up money to take the GRE to pay for my applications, and I got it. I actually only got into one school by the deadline, which was the University of Missouri. And I had been waitlisted at 6 places. All of them ended up being like, yeah, sorry, not this year. So I was like, all right, I'm going to Mizzou. I know some people at Mizzou. That's cool. And then 3 days after the grad school deadline, I got a call at 7 in the morning um, from the University of Wisconsin Madison, and they were like, "Hey, actually, I know it's late, but would you like off the wait list?" And there were people who I had really hoped to work with there, so Mizzou was great. They were great about me being like, "Hey, actually, can I go to this other place?" And so I ended up in Madison.
How did so you applied to a bunch of, I mean, my story is so similar too. It was eventually first round I got accepted to a master's program that was really expensive, couldn't do that, so I needed to do another round, got accepted to like one school, waitlist, yeah, similar story. um how did you apply to schools based on individuals that you wanted to work with at each school and sort of know what you might be specializing in? Or how did you look at even going through all the options that you wanted at that point?
Yeah, so in that era, a common piece of advice was you have three different groups of schools that you apply to. You apply to schools that you're pretty sure you could get into. That's one group. A group of schools that you think you might be able to get into that you would like to go to, and then a group of reach schools that you think you probably can't get into, but might as well try. So that's what I did. I picked. I did not. I did not have a lot of money, so I picked three schools in each category to apply to, and Madison was in that middle category. So I ended up. I was really happy about getting into there. But yeah, I basically for each one of those categories, I was like, which three schools do I like best in each of these categories? And I had definitely had particular people at Wisconsin I was interested in working with.
Nice. Yeah. And I know a little bit about that school. I mean, it has a great reputation, good school. When you got there, did you follow a plan that you, like your original plan? Did that evolve and change as you did coursework and you started writing a little bit more research and probably trying to publish at some point? Like, what was the evolution there of your interests?
Yeah, so initially I was interested. I went into grad school thinking I was definitely going to do ethics, hopefully meta ethics. That's and which makes sense why I think for anyone who knows anything about grad programs, you think of meta ethics. Wisconsin Madison is a place you think of, maybe right after UNC Chapel Hill, and so I went in there thinking that's what I wanted to do. I had written my writing sample on Philippa Foot and her later work. And after a couple years, I realized I really didn't want to do meta ethics. Not only did I kind of not want to do meta ethics, I really didn't want to do meta ethics. And I ended up switching to philosophy of action and working with Sarah Paul, who was there at the time. She's at NYU Abu Dhabi now, but at the time she was there, and she became my advisor, and she's fantastic. Her work is amazing. She was an amazing advisor. So I ended up going from ethics to philosophy of action, which has informed a lot of the work that I've done since then.
All right, and so for that's not a field or even like a subtopic that I'm all that familiar with, like a little bit, but for those who don't understand what the at least some of the main issues are in philosophy of action, what kind of work do you see in the field, and then what made you gravitate towards that as like a main topic?
Yeah, it's a really broad subfield. Some questions in philosophy of action are a lot more applied. Stuff like under what conditions is someone acting, and you have questions about free will, questions about blame and responsibility, stuff like that. Um, and then you have a lot more abstract theoretical stuff, like kind of the ontological nature of what an action is, and then there's the stuff that I worked on, which is action explanation. So here's an example. When you ask me why I'm going to the store, and I tell you I'm going to the store to get bread, I'm explaining what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. But how come that reason that I gave you, like I need bread, how come that explains what I'm doing? Why is it that reason explains what I'm doing? That seems really banal. We talk this way all day. We give reasons for what we're doing, and we don't really think about the relationship that those reasons bear to the action that it's explaining or why that's important. So the reason that a lot of philosophers of action think that's important is that they think the nature of the explanatory relationship between reasons and actions, so the reason that reasons explain actions, can tell us stuff about the nature of action itself. So some well-known philosophers who worked on this would be Elizabeth Anscombe, Ludwig Wittgenstein, Donald Davidson, and then more contemporary thinkers as well. But that was sort of the start of the contemporary philosophy of action tradition.
Okay, nice. So this is going to be a little bit more for like philosophy nerds, but I'm interested in a couple things related to what you just said. One is, well, I'm having so my one of my advisors was Nathan Howard, who's now at Toronto, and he worked with Mark Schroeder, and they just have a co-author book that just came out all about reasons. I hope to talk with him about it. And so I'm interested if you did work on reasons in particular, but also, you said before you wanted to stay away from meta ethics, but I imagine that there's a lot of overlap with the kinds of things that you're describing in meta ethics as well. So did you uh, did you make good on that and actually steer clear of meta ethics, or did you kind of get dragged back into it based on your research interests?
Well, I guess it depends who you ask. I don't know if the stuff that I work on would get into the Madison Meta Ethics workshop. I don't know if it's that meta ethicsy, but it's definitely on the periphery. Um, I have done some work on reasons, but it's always en route to a thing that I'm arguing with respect to explanation. So I'm really interested, I'm interested in the way that reasons explain what we do. But in order to make those arguments, I have had to engage with different pictures of reasons. And the one that I endorse, I guess, is one that was kind of made famous, I guess, by Michael Thompson at Pittsburgh, called the naive picture, naive action theory, which is this idea that when we give reasons for what we're doing, those reasons that we cite for what we're doing, those are also actions. So when I say I'm going to the store because I need ingredients for a cake or something, what that reason that I just gave you it's another action I'm engaged in, the action of making a cake. The idea that reasons are actions and that actions are embedded in other actions in a sort of Russian nesting doll style.
Wow. Okay. There's a lot there. Good. I'm tempted to go into more detail on that, but again, maybe I can just sort of like bookmark that. Um, so your research ends, I mean, it's fascinating. Can you talk a little bit about how your experience in grad school was like socially? Like, I don't know if you were married at the time or what it was like to either be married or single, but like, what was that experience like? And then the, I assume, daunting task of looking at the job market and going, okay, how am I going to navigate this? What are my priorities, et cetera? So, what was that era like for you in whatever status you had at the time?
Sure, yeah. So when I came to grad school, I was single. I did end up meeting my husband in grad school, and we were married during my last year of grad school, right before my last year of grad school. So I was married a little bit in grad school, dated my husband through a couple years of it, and was single for some of it. So I experienced it all. Um, and socially, grad school was great. I made a lot of really good friends there, and always had someone to, go somewhere with at 11 p.m. and talk about whatever. And it was really wonderful, actually. A lot of people talk about this, actually, the jarring effect of going from grad school to your first job, especially if it involves moving to a totally different place where you've gone from hanging out with people and talking about philosophy every day to like maybe just being totally alone. And we did actually experience that as being very jarring. Because we had a really great life in Madison. So I think for us, at least socially, it was wonderful. The job market, yeah, I had a sort of different experience. I actually got my first job before I graduated, and worked at my first job about a semester before I got my PhD. It was a visiting position at Utah State University, and so I was technically a lecturer for half of it, and then visiting assistant professor for the second half of that year. But yeah, I mean, it was very daunting, and I think especially in our position, we have what's known as a two body problem, where both of us are do the same thing, you know, and like you said, it's not like there's jobs for philosophers everywhere, and we weren't willing to live apart. So there, at one point, my husband had and I had to decide, well, are we going to go with my job offer or your job offer? And it can't be both. But happily, really, really fortunately, it did work out for us ultimately. But there were definitely many years where only one of us was employed, and we were sort of applying for things frantically, and yeah, not definitely stressful.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, it's already stressful just one person trying to land something. So you were fortunate that you, and by merit, of course, that you landed a job even before you graduated. And I know that's not the place that you are at now. So what was the process of going from that position, married, to where you end up today?
From my visiting position to
Yeah.
the one, yeah, it was a multi-step process. So yeah, so we were in Utah for a year at this visiting position. Definitely the most beautiful place I've ever lived. I will say that. Man, it's nice. Also, I have to say, because maybe some of my former students from there might be watching this, but I had the most incredible students at Utah State, some of whom I still talk to, and one of whom is in grad school at the University of Kansas. And it was a delight being there. But yeah, so okay, so we're in Utah. We're applying for jobs. My husband actually had a job at the time. He was an assistant professor at the Milwaukee School of Engineering, and they let him be online for a year. And then he was supposed to go back to in person. So we were in Utah for the year. He was online for that year, and they said, okay, now you have to come back to Milwaukee. During that time, I got a job offer at the College of Saint Scholastica in Duluth, Minnesota. So that's when we had to make this decision. Do we go back to Milwaukee and then I don't have a job and I look around, or do we go to Duluth and he doesn't have a job and he looks around? And there were a lot of factors that went into this decision, and we ultimately went with Duluth mostly because it was tenure track, whereas his job was uh, permanent renewing but not tenure track. And Wisconsin has kind of weird laws around academic employment, so we thought that the Minnesota job would be more stable. Um, we were also only in Duluth for a year, though, and the reasons for that are complicated. But there was basically there was a moment, more than a moment, where it was the job was not looking as stable as it had seemed, due to some kind of urgent university financial issues. Um, and what made that even scarier is that when I found this out, when our school found this out, I was 6 months pregnant. And so back to frantically applying for everything that we could find. And that's how I ended up in Arkansas, which, and I'm very happy about it. It's a great job. It's a great place. We really like Little Rock. So that was that process.
Okay, that's quite a process. And I should add, so you were a visiting assistant professor at Utah State, and was it only for a year? Is that why you were sort of immediately applying for a job?
It was renewable for up to 3 years,
Hmm.
but because I had an offer, and those don't come around all the time, that's why we sort of just decided to take it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, okay, so it requires a lot of moving during that process, and married, and you all are starting a family. When you look back, I mean, how do you characterize it? Like, obviously difficult, yeah, but I mean, can you say more about just like your psychological state during that time? Because I know just hearing about this, I'm going, I would have just been, I would have had to do my job, but I would have been stressed for a good chunk of that time. Or maybe you just handle things much better than I do.
Oh no, it was incredibly stressful. I think the our lives from that moment, kind of finding out that we had to apply out again to moving to Little Rock. That period of my life was probably the most stressful I've ever experienced, especially because our move to Arkansas happened just 3 months after our first daughter was born. And so, kind of selling the house and all that kind of stuff with the newborn was very challenging, especially being in Duluth, Minnesota, which is, I don't know if you know where that's at, it's way up north. Really like 9 to 10 hours away from the closest person we know, really. Just an absolutely frigid, wild area. I mean, I felt like we were in like a Discovery Channel show in the winter. We also discovered we were not really built for the north. When we were, it's beautiful. I will say it's beautiful. A lot of people love Duluth. I suspect most of them have only been there in the summer, but I don't know. Um, but yeah, really, it was very kind of lonely and stressful and isolating for that year, even though everyone at the school was wonderful. Um, yeah, it was a sort of a dismal time. It was definitely much better after we got settled into Arkansas and figured out a little better, I think, how to be parents. Because man, that first one really hits you.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, I mean that's a whole other factor. And so when you were looking at all these jobs, I'm interested in the how you weighed some of those isolation costs. I mean, I when I was in grad school, I had so I was at Texas A&M in College Station, and I had some extended family in like the Fort Worth area, but most of my immediate family, actually all of my immediate family, was hundreds and hundreds of miles away, just not even drivable except for in like a couple days. And I know for me, it weighed on me quite a bit. That social isolation, but also the family isolation, was when you were looking at the job market and knowing you just were kind of at the mercy of whatever's available. Um, how did you think about that sort of thing? It was just like a cost that you had to be willing to accept, or what was the mindset there?
I have to say, I think until we had kids, I didn't think about it as much. I missed my family in grad school. It was the first time I'd ever been away from them. Your parents drop you off with the moving truck, and now you're 7 to 8 hours away from anyone anyone who cares if you're alive or dead, and it's sort of weird and scary, but it's only you. So at least for me, that wasn't as bad. But now having kids and having siblings who have kids, um, and all of these cousins that my children love to play with when they're around them, having to leave them then and go back to this place where we still aren't really that close to anyone, even though we've been here 2.5 years, is it's still hard. And you're right, it is. You are at the mercy of the job market, and there are a lot of benefits that this kind of work gives us as parents, but the one big downside is isolation from family. And I mean, it's a big downside.
Yeah, and as you have small kids, I imagine you feel that more. And like you said, yeah, the cousins don't get a chance to play together as often, and so that's one of the reasons that I moved my family someplace to like right in the city where my at least part of my extended family was and still is, and then other members of my family fortunately are down here now too. That's a whole long story, but I say that because I get the impression from at least some of what you post on social media that like this is an issue that isn't talked about that much, that actually does deserve a little bit more attention, especially from a mother's perspective, a wife's and a mother's perspective. So, what have you experienced uniquely when it comes to life in academia from your perspective that isn't really talked about all that much out there in academic circles.
Yeah, so I think the main thing for us, and this will differ depending on where you're at. So I have a lot of peers who are at Catholic universities where there's a lot of people with kids. Maybe everyone has kids almost, and this is just sort of the norm. I think for a lot of places it's not the norm though. The vast majority of people that I went to grad school with don't have kids, whether by choice or just circumstance. And the people that I work with, my colleagues, some of them have kids, but they're grown. They're maybe my age, and then my colleagues who are our age don't. And it puts one in a social situation, I think, where I don't know, the things people are going at, like, we'll get invited to things, but maybe it's like someone's band's show that's at midnight, and it's like, man, I'd love to go to that, but I don't think they let babies in bars. So uh, so things like that. The kind of cross section of parent of young kid and academic is one that is, I think, in my experience, sparsely populated. And where I live in Arkansas, there's the added complication, I think, of a lot of people are kind of, I don't know if I want to say suspicious, but they hear that maybe you're in academia or you're a professor, and they don't really know maybe what to say um, to you, and assume that maybe they won't have anything in common with you. And so I think that's been a really difficult thing, kind of finding a place where it makes sense socially to both, be parents of young kids and also have these like academic interests that we want to talk about with other people. And uh, yeah, it continues, I think, to be isolating. We haven't really found a great solution to it yet.
So at least, am I hearing that like there's sort of this, you're in a unique position in academic circles because of the family situation. You're also in a unique position just outside of academic circles because of the academic profession that you've chosen, and people don't really know exactly, so I guess, how to have conversation or like what your interests are and how to kind of I don't know, ask you questions about that because it's a little bit more foreign than maybe some other jobs. So there's like this challenge to have a community on both sides of things. Is that part of it?
Right. Yeah. I mean, yeah, you're talking to other parents at the park, and I just feel like the worst thing that you can tell them is like, "Oh yeah, I'm a professor of philosophy." What are they supposed to say to that? But then invariably they ask what you do. Um, yeah, and I think another challenge, sort of related, sort of not though, is a lot of the things that are common in academia, like conferences, for instance. Um, those are extremely hard with kids. I think I have done one. I've traveled to one conference since having kids. I participated in others, but virtually. That's extremely difficult, I think, especially if you do not have family in the area that can watch the kids for a few days while you go there. It's just really, really hard, especially when they're so young. It's really been prohibitively difficult for me. I actually, on Twitter or X, a few weeks ago, I floated the idea of having philosophy conferences specifically for like people who need to or want to bring their kids, and ways that that could be set up, which I still think is a great idea. So maybe sometime I'll try to get enough people interested in that to get it off the ground.
Okay, I would be all for that. I will help in whatever ways I can for sure, because I mean, I see the exact same thing. I've talked about this a decent amount on this podcast in various episodes. Most recently, the one with Marcus Arvin, Dr. Marcus Arvin, because, well, for all kinds of reasons. If you want to go back and for the listeners and viewers, you can listen to that episode. We talk a lot about like the field as a whole, but I have this working idea that, and I want to hear your opinion on it, where the I know the philosophy market, but the philosophy profession just seems to filter out at all those stages people who need to prioritize being a spouse, but particularly being a parent. I mean, because you have to dedicate, in anyone's position, if they're trying to get tenure, well, number one, if they're trying to just get a job out of grad school, that's extremely difficult. And then if they're trying to get tenure, let's say that's it's the dream. You have landed a tenure track position. It's it's amazing, but you have to do, depending on the school, probably a lot of research, and that takes a ton of time, and it takes a ton of time in isolation from other things. It's not the kind of thing that you can do well in most cases with a lot of kids running around and a lot of interruptions. You have to have these blocks of time that you dedicate towards the research. And just like you said, going to conferences seems like a part of that as well. And so there's just, I don't know, the field and the profession has created this environment that seems in one sense extremely hostile to people with families. So I'm observing the same thing. I don't know if you have any immediate thoughts on that.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, right. So in any job, there's going to be like blocks of time where you have to be working. But I think in academia, there's a idea that sort of the more you work, the better. And the more dedicated to your research you are, the more important your research is. And so, because there's not like, you have to be in the office from 9 to 5 every day kind of rules at this kind of work, it's, all the time when you're home, when you're around your family, you're, maybe in the back of your mind, you're like, if I were just reading a few more PDFs right now, um, maybe I could sharpen my ideas a little bit better. Um, I think I think this really weighs on a lot of people. For some reason, I think by and large, I've managed to be a little bit buffered from that. Maybe just because, maybe just because compared to how much, like, I don't know, how much I enjoy my kids, I just don't really care or something. But I feel it too. I have this kind of like nagging worry in the back of my head, like, gosh, why don't I have a book proposal done yet? It's because, we're going to the park too much or something like that. Yeah, but I think especially not having like, punch in at 9, punch out at 5 kind of like rules around when you're working can create this situation where you feel like you need to be kind of working all the time.
Yeah, for sure. I feel that too. I also, there was a sense where, to your point before, that, and well, both of our points, that the profession doesn't have, at least in some circles, a lot of people who have kids. And I felt the social isolation from that because there was no one really, there were a couple, but by and large, there wasn't a lot of people to talk to about the kinds of things that I was experiencing outside the profession and also the struggles within the profession as well. And that, at least to me, that was something that weighed psychologically on me. Yeah, again, just sort of like the isolated nature, and I can imagine it being a maybe more intense experience as a mother who's in academia. But I want you to comment on that. Like, do you see that differently from, let's say, your husband?
There was a great anecdote that I read by Christopher Frey, who's a philosopher at Tulsa, on Twitter the other day. I'm going to keep calling it Twitter because I can't call it X. It just sounds too strange. He was telling the story about when he was giving a talk one time when he had, when his kids, one of his kids at least, was young. And he said, so his young kid was there, and he said he realized he needed like a diaper change. And so he during the Q&A portion of his talk, he just changed his kid's diaper kind of like up there while he was finishing his talk. And I had two immediate thoughts about that. And the first one was, that's awesome. I wish that this were normalized. I wish I could feel free to just like bring my baby to a talk I was given. And the second one was, that would look so different, I think, if it were a mom instead of a dad. I think the optics would be really, really different. I don't think they should be different, and I would hope that wouldn't prevent me from doing that. But I do think they would be different, and I think that's a problem.
Yeah, I so is do you either accurately or maybe different degrees of accuracy like feel a sort of stigma that maybe you're not because you have kids, maybe you're not pursuing your academic interests as much as possible. And I'll pause here to say that at least at the time of the recording, I just heard L.A. Paul talk about a lot of this on Tim Ferriss's podcast, which I can't believe that a legit amazing philosopher was on a huge podcast like that. Very cool. So, okay, that's enough of that. But she has a lot of things to say about becoming a parent as an academic. So I guess I'll leave it at the simple question and like, do you feel a sort of, I guess, anything because you're a parent in the context of academia?
Yeah, I do. But I think the feeling is a little bit vague, and I will say I do think it's getting better. Like you said, I think just the bare fact that I think a much smaller percentage of academics, and I think especially academic philosophers, have children than the general public. Just because of that, people with children, especially young children, there's always going to be maybe sort of just a general, maybe not knowing exactly how to interact with them about it, which is okay. Um, but yeah, I think and especially as a mother, I think it might be, although, men can weigh in on this, it might be slightly different as a father. But as a mother, especially, yeah, the sort of feeling that maybe like in the back of people's minds, they're thinking, oh, um, she's not going to do as much as she could have if she hadn't had kids. She's not going to write as much or write as significant of stuff as she could have had she not had kids. And my thoughts on that are it's not even immediately that that's not true. It probably is true that I maybe would have written more. Although I will say, I bet you would say the same thing, that having kids makes you way more efficient with the time that you do have to write. At least that's how it was for me. I do not waste time now when I'm writing, researching. Um, but like maybe it is true. Maybe I would have written more if I hadn't had kids. But well, one, that's true of a lot of life experiences. If you hadn't done X, Y, Z, maybe you would have written more. Doesn't seem like some any sort of argument against doing X, Y, and Z. But also, I think it's, for me anyway, having children has been something that has been extremely illuminating in ways that are directly relevant to the things I'm thinking about. So even if I'm not maybe publishing as much as I would have if I didn't have kids, I don't even know how to evaluate that counterfactual, but let's say it's true. Um, yeah, I think that what I'm doing benefits from my experiences as a mother. So yeah, I do think that there might be this idea that productivity goes down when you're a mom, and maybe it does. And maybe there's this sort of like worry that this is gonna like negatively impact your job prospects or your tenure prospects. But I do think at the end of the day, it's not directly relevant to the value of what you're doing as a philosopher. And I think actually being a parent, like I said, is directly valuable toward being a philosopher.
I think that's so helpful. I want to elaborate or maybe ask you a little bit more about how being a parent either directly or indirectly influences some of the things you're thinking about. But just to say that I relate completely to so much of what you said, because when I was in grad school and I had kids, so I entered grad school with three kids, one on the way. And so we had our first while I was in grad school. I mean, it was our fourth kid, but it was the first kid that we had in grad school at the end of that first semester, and then not quite towards like the last year, we had our fifth kid. So I had a lot of kids in grad school, and I could just sort of like, maybe this is on me and no one was thinking anything, but I did kind of feel this sense of, look, we've invested a lot in you as a graduate student. Just completing the program is very difficult. but also the job market, like that is extremely difficult. Publishing is extremely difficult. We expect you to do all these things, and we know as tenured professors that that requires almost 24/7 productivity. I mean, night and day. This is what you're going to be eating, sleeping, and breathing. And sort of this, I don't know, again, I might be wrong on this, but this kind of like, well, I don't get it, but okay, but listen, you're going to have to do all these things. So hey, if you want to do this and have the kids, okay, but we're not going to let up on your thing. So again, that was just sort of my psychology. Again, I'll pause, and I don't know if you can relate to like those specifics, but that's, I felt a lot of that as well.
Yes, absolutely. I will say at my current job, I don't feel that at all, but certainly on the job market, especially. And the job that I interviewed for, I actually got I interviewed for it when I was 8.5 months pregnant, and did some other interviews in that state as well. So definitely, yes, for sure felt that, especially being like super pregnant, going to interviews, feeling like the only thing they're thinking of is oh cool, so in like 1 month she's going to be like totally out of commission for half a year. We should definitely hire her. Right, definitely a real worry on my end as well. I mean, yeah, and it's weird because every like good thing in life is like this, right? Every good thing in life is something that you're spending time on that, such that you're not spending time directly on research or work in some other way. But we don't tend to feel that way or think that about these other good things like traveling or getting married or anything like that. But with kids, we do, and that always seems like that seems really unfair to me, but it's totally there.
Yeah. Okay. Good. I do want to then come back to how has well so many questions, but like how does your idea of human flourishing, how is that now shaped now that you are a mother and you have kids, number one, and then how has just being a parent had some sort of influence on your work, on your teaching? I can imagine it's pretty systemic, but how do you organize your thoughts on that and look at it sort of reflectively?
Yeah, so one thing that being a parent has done for me, I'm not prescribing this as any sort of universal mental health treatment, but for me specifically, this is why it's hard for me to say that I'm less productive now. I'm not sure that I am, because in grad school, I just remember being extremely anxious, fighting anxiety and depression pretty much constantly through grad school and through college. And now that I have kids, and I'm in some ways just extremely busy all the time, that has really lessened for me. And I think for me, a lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of it just sort of came from being in a place in life where my focus was just sort of on myself all the time, on my work, or on my I don't know, my social interactions with people. It was just always really insular, in the way that it is kind of when you're sort of by yourself or single or whatever. And and so that's been like really mentally clarifying for me in a lot of ways. But it's also been just I think earlier in this podcast I said, oh, that first kid really hits you. So the transition from 0 kids to 1 kid was for us just such like an explosion. And that it just completely transformed what I thought it meant to like be selfless. I think I had no idea before. And then, and I thought I did really know what it meant to like live your life like in service to others, like loving people in a selfless way. And I really think I didn't until I was in a position where I literally had to keep a completely incapable being alive in every way. And so it really totally changed. I'm trying to find the right words. But I went from thinking I knew what it meant to be selfless and serve people selflessly to realizing I had not, and I probably still don't. But it really humbled me in that way, I think, in the ways that I think about like love and sacrifice, which are things that I'm interested in my work as well. So in that way, it's been very illuminating.
That's great. I wonder, I get the sense that maybe you have more of an idea of what goes on at the research level when it comes, if anything, when it comes to being a parent, being a mother, being a father, having kids in philosophy. Most of what I see is I wouldn't describe it as pro family, let's say. It's discouraging people from having kids in the first place for all the reasons that we could mention. And I mean, I so maybe that's the best way to say it is I don't see a balance of, well, look, there's a lot of literature that argues for the benefits of family life. There are two people that I go to when I think about this. Mary Harrington, I'm not sure if you're familiar with her, but she talks about like a mother-sized whole being she talks about like in modern feminism, but I think about it in terms of professions and discussions and theories. Rob Henderson kind of has the same argument where he talks about like a child size whole. Like, where are we prioritizing these two groups, mothers and kids? And at least in the philosophy profession, I see two massive gaps in the research literature, but I'm very willing to be corrected on that. So I'm wondering, do you have an impression of any sort of research going on that is a trend that is somewhat pro family? Because I haven't seen it.
Um, a little bit. So I will say this isn't, as of yet, this has not been a major research area of mine, but I do know that one of my professors in grad school, Harry Brighouse, he does research on sort of like the politics of family life, um, and the ways that kids are a lot of times like commodified, or that family life is made much more difficult in various ways. And one of his students, who is now at Harvard, Gina Schouten, also does work on kind of like the politics that govern and control and influence family life. And they both do amazing work on this. And you brought up L.A. Paul and her work on becoming a parent as a transformative experience. I think Agnes Callard also has written stuff on becoming a parent as a transformative experience. But yeah, there's really not a lot. There's a real sense in which kids, and especially young kids, are upfront, in your face, kind of everything that as adults we try to hide about ourselves. They are loud, and you know what they're thinking and feeling all the time. They're kind of like these big bundles of bodily functions and big emotions. And we're like that too, but we hide it. We keep it out of kind of polite company. And I think especially as academics, and maybe especially as academic philosophers, this is something that this is a way we don't like to think of ourselves. We like to think of ourselves as a mind, as rational people. And children make us remember that the kind of animals we are aren't really like that for large chunks of our lives. And then there's also this idea, not only that, but also that kids are a choice, and almost like a luxury choice to have. Having kids has sort of taken on this aura of being like getting sort of like a luxury dog or something like that, something that's like really expensive, and if you really want it, cool, but that's a real commitment. So those two ideas together, kids become a kind of extension of ourselves, something that we decided is really important. This decision to have them, and then it sort of it sort of becomes the case that people think, well, if they're okay with putting these loud, noisy, sometimes smelly, squirmy little beings right out there alongside them, the idea is that becomes like an extension of you. And I think that's part of the reason that maybe academics feel a kind of stigma or even embarrassment about about having kids or being in an academic setting with kids, this idea that the rational part of them is being undermined by this little mini extension of them that really isn't rational at all. Um, and so I can see why people wouldn't like that. On the other hand, though, I actually think it's great. I think it's important for how we think about human life and human flourishing, because the fact is that we have the same things these kids have. We have these emotions. We have lots of moments of irrationality. We have all these bodily functions. We have large chunks of our lives where we're completely dependent on the care of other people. And not recognizing that leads to a lot of weird thinking about what human life is. And this is actually one of the larger projects that I'm working on right now, has to do with thinking through laws regarding assisted dying, physician assisted dying, assisted suicide, whatever you want to call it. And the conversation that often accompanies that, these conversations about independence and dependence, and conversations about dignity, that I think get really confused just because we really don't think of dependent portions of our lives as good portions of our lives. I think that's a mistake, but I think that it make sense why often we feel so weird about young kids. Yeah, so if you are a parent in academia, or if you are wanting to be or thinking about becoming a parent in academia, I guess I don't know if this is really advice so much as it is just, I think that there's actually quite a few of us who would love to see more of your kids with you. In fact, my students, I teach a lot of older adult students who have young kids. And I say, you know what, sometimes childcare falls through. And if you need to or want to bring them, just do it. And there are sometimes some classroom disruptions, but also, like, who cares? I think that if we have this idea that that we need to keep all disruptions out of these sorts of places, that just excludes so many groups of people, not just young kids, but so many groups of people. And they just get boiled down to just their disruptive capacities rather than all their other capacities for being great contributions to the environment. So if you're ever coming to my class or a talk of mine, anyone with a kid, please bring them. There's probably going to be a lot of talks that I'm at, or classes that I'm in, or whatever, where I have one or both of my kids with me. And I guess at this point, I'm kind of done feeling embarrassed or worried about it. And I will say something that I kind of didn't expect to be the case. Before I became a parent, I figured after I had kids, I'd have a ton of like philosophical thoughts about like child raising and stuff like that. And it couldn't be further from the truth. Um, I always describe it to my husband as like having kids made me realize just sort of how biological of a creature I am. At least it's maybe changing a little bit now, but initially it was an extremely unphilosophical experience for me. Sort of feeling like kind of at the mercy of my biology in a lot of ways, which now I think I can reflect on philosophically in some interesting ways. But I think you're totally right that this is a gap, but I also understand the gap because I think it's a really hard area to think about.
Yeah, and I wonder if, I mean, I think, yes, and I totally agree. I wonder if part of the difficulty is that there's not a lot of literature to build on. Like you're gonna have to be this philosopher who's like hacking away because there really isn't some trail that you can follow, at least again from what I'm saying. And I'm happy to be corrected on this, but again, that's just sort of my impression is a lot of this is going to have to be almost from scratch.
Yeah, totally. There's nothing that analytic philosophers hate more than not being able to just, enter one tiny corner of a literature and be like, parenting versus schmerenting. Let's write a paper on that or something like that.
Yeah, totally. I also wonder if this has some sort of effect for either people trying to get into philosophy or just people who are outside the profession in terms of just their impressions of philosophy. Because if a lot of people are having maybe a more positive experience with parenting and being a spouse and that sort of thing, then and not finding maybe some of their interests in philosophy. I mean, I'm kind of over psychologizing this in a way, but it's a segue into um, what has been your experience in getting people to actually come towards this way in the philosophy profession, the things that appeal to the everyday person. I'm really interested in how do how does anyone who is in the profession sort of sell or pitch or get people who initially aren't interested in the profession actually to think about these things in a more deep way so that they're actually organically interested.
Yeah, so I guess one way that I try to do that is through the podcast that we have called Philosophy on the Fringes, which is this was just sort of a labor of love, my husband and I. Yeah, what is true, I think, is that people do like to think about things. What is probably also true is that what they think, their idea of philosophers is such that they don't like to think about things that philosophers like to think about. Because they think of philosophers as pedantic, as overthinking questions that are boring, or that don't have any significance to life or to important things in life. And while I don't think that's true, I understand why they have that impression. Um, and so I think that, one of the things we try to do with our podcast and something I think is just important to do in general. And I've actually taught the topic of so our podcast, I've actually taught that as like a class at my school, which has been fun. What we try to do is sort of show that you can really think philosophically about basically anything. And then it's good too, because to think philosophically just means to kind of pursue wisdom about whatever it is that you're thinking about. Um, so I think that's probably the best way. Everyone's interested in something. Everyone has an interest in living a good life, no matter what their idea of good might be. They're interested in that almost by definition. And so everyone's interested in something, but people might not know that that means that they are well positioned to be philosophers about it.
That's great. Can you say a little bit more about the class? I'm really interested. How did that come up? And what are some takeaways from that?
Yeah, so I was asked to teach just sort of a special topics class over the summer last year of my choosing. But someone brought up it might be cool to do it on the theme of our podcast. And so the class is called Philosophy of Weird Things. And we just talk about, it's an 8-week course. So we talk about 8 different weird things. Among them are like Bigfoot and other cryptids, extraterrestrial life, virtual minds, alchemy, um, mythology, just things that are interesting. They're kind of out there and are often the subject of really bad analysis in things like, ancient aliens or something like that. But hopefully, students come away from the class knowing that you can also do good thinking about these topics.
So, as an example, what is a philosophical issue that comes up surrounding alchemy?
Oh yeah, so one thing that in our podcast episode on alchemy that we talk about is this. Well, there was straightforward alchemy where you just have pretty much straightforward chemistry attempts to turn cheap kinds of metals into gold, and this sort of evolved socially into alchemy as kind of like almost a spiritual practice where the interest is in not just changing the nature of metals but changing the nature of all kinds of things. You want to create the philosopher's stone. You want to change the nature of man to be something immortal. So it's on the pursuit of not just changing the nature of metals, but changing the nature of maybe of anything. And on the possibilities of changing the nature of something. Can you change the nature of something and still retain the thing, or is that meaningless?
That's fascinating. So, I mean, as someone who has a podcast, obviously, I'm interested. It's people don't understand the amount of work that it takes and the amount of effort and time and everything that sort of thing takes. What has been your maybe I can ask it this way. What have been some of the ups and downs of voluntarily doing a podcast on philosophy while you are, I assume, so busy with the profession and being and your family life that we've already talked about?
Yeah, a lot of people are like, why do you do that? And fair question, because it's not sponsored or anything. Like I said, it's really a labor of love. And so one motivation is personal, which is that it is like a very fun thing that my husband and I do together. We really love it. We started it because we just had all of these great conversations about random things all the time. I have to give a shout out to my husband here. So, Frank, he is so smart, and he's also just like this, like research, like I don't. He's like a machine. If he's interested in a topic, he can do this in-depth research on it, and like you give him a day, and he can tell you anything. He's amazing. He's a super fast reader. He has like a photographic memory, so he's a machine when it comes to this. He's really really gifted, and so he would be reading about whatever because he's also interested in everything. And he would bring it up to me, and we'd start having these philosophical discussions about them. And I was like, man, we should like record them because, it might be cool to go back to if we're ever writing a paper on this, blah, blah, blah. And then some of our siblings expressed interest in listening to the recordings if we ever did that. And it just kind of snowballed from there. And we have a small but pretty consistent listenership now.
Good for you. I think that's awesome. I mean, that I can imagine. I mean, it sounds so from the outside. I can imagine a relationship where it's two philosophers being fulfilling in so many different ways. Um, can you and you can punt this question? You can just totally reject this question, but I imagine you get the question all the time. What is it like to be married to another philosopher where you have the same general profession and interests and that sort of thing? Um, what do you, since you've gotten that question, I'm sure 100 times, can you give me your stock answer or a different one, whatever you prefer?
Oh yeah, no. So for me, it's great. And I always sort of thought that I really couldn't be married to someone who just I think just because of my disposition, not because like philosophers are better than I think just because of my disposition, I don't think I would have been able to marry someone that I didn't have this in common with. Just because for me, it's really that's really like the center of me. I think. Um, I think he'd probably say the same. Although he, it's probably a little worse for him because I'm more I have more of the flaws of like analytic philosophy brain than he does. Just in maybe understanding things too literally, not not trying to be difficult. Just I'll understand him as saying something in a really literal sense, and turns out that's not how any normal human would have understood it. And that results in some miscommunications. But we've gotten better at that. A lot of people bring up that it might make our kids weird, which only time will tell on that.
Yeah, I think that's an okay cost. I mean, it depends on what the kind of weirdness amounts to, but I can imagine some really cool discussions happening. So that seems like a good thing to me. I'm interested, and I want to be mindful of your time here, but I'm interested. So your training was in obviously analytic philosophy. You have some history of philosophy interests, and you have ventured into continental philosophy. I'm interested in what were the formal tools that you had to really sharpen, develop in order to be at the level that you wanted to be, I guess, during grad school and in your research?
For doing analytic philosophy or continental?
Well, I'm thinking mostly analytic, but if there was translation work or something that you're doing in Continental, I'm interested in that too. But I'm thinking particularly like formal logic and maybe probability and those sorts of things. I'm
Yeah.
always interested in the formal training that someone has to do in the specialized skills and the technical skills.
Yeah, actually, that was a big thing I was nervous about when I declared my philosophy major, because in high school I had just been terrible at math, and I knew I had to be good at logic to do this kind of work. I did not. I ended up I ended up loving logic, weirdly. I don't really know why. Maybe it was just knowing that I had to do it in order to do philosophy or do what I wanted to do in philosophy. But yeah, definitely did a lot of logic. I took 3 logic courses in college, actually. I took the one I needed, and then I liked it, so I ended up taking more. Um, and then once I started doing my dissertation, I needed to learn some Bayesian epistemology. I needed to learn some more technical stuff on scientific explanation for my dissertation. Um, I nearly took a I nearly took a class on uh, now I'm forgetting the term on deontic logic. That's the term. I nearly took a course on deontic logic. I ended up not doing that. But I think that would have been really interesting. I am now wanting to get more into math. And this is distantly related to my interest in Platonic metaphysics, but I'm wanting to get to learn a little more higher maths. And so I might be trying to independently do some set theory work soon. So we'll see how that goes.
Oh, interesting. So have you started that? Because I'm interested in, I always say like eventually I'm going to go into set theory on some level, but have you started that process yet?
No, my husband's supposed to be figuring out the best curriculum for me to use. So, but I'll let you know when when he decides on something. He's really good at math, so he's gonna try to facilitate that.
Oh, that's so cool. That's really great that you have him as a resource. Yeah, it's one of those things. I did a little bit of it in grad school, and doing a little bit of it is even an exaggeration. I was exposed to a lot of the theories and the principles and that sort of thing, and I tried to work through some of the beginning stages when I was there. Partially because Christopher Menzel was my supervisor, and so he was
Oh, no
obviously
way!
extremely proficient in just logic that I'll never get to in my wildest dreams. But the exposure was awesome because I at least was shown, hey, this is as high as a lot of people can get, and even further. So that was nice.
Awesome.
Yeah. Um, well, to cap it off, I'm wondering if there is someone out there who is thinking of studying philosophy, maybe in a similar position. How do you advise? Maybe you advise students now who are interested in philosophy and want to go into it as a profession, but how do you think about that at this point when you have been through all of these major professional transitions and changes and hurdles and that sort of thing, coupled with all the life challenges that those bring as well? How do you advise people in going into the profession? Are there a few, I don't know, points of advice that immediately come to mind?
I'm actually really glad you asked this question because I used to give a piece of advice to this, which I now think was bad. I used to tell people that they should only think about going to grad school if they really felt like they had something to contribute to sort of the conversation, as it were. I think that's really bad advice now because I think the things that one thinks they have to contribute to the conversation when they're at that point um, are probably mistaken. And anyway, uh, doesn't necessarily indicate kind of a epistemically humble attitude, which I certainly didn't have one when I was deciding whether or not to go to grad school. But I think I should have. So, my new advice is that I think really one should only pursue this if they, well, first of all, you definitely shouldn't pursue it if you don't have a passion for teaching. Please don't do it if you don't like to teach. There are so many people in philosophy who hate to teach and only do it because they have to. Please don't be one of them. Um, and also, I think it's a good thing to do if you really if you really feel like you have questions about deep questions about what it would mean to live a good life that you think wouldn't really be answered any other way besides having time to really dig into them. I think that's a good reason to do it, because I know grad school gave me that time, and I'm really glad I did.
For me, I think that's great advice, and I'll echo at least part of what you said, which is many people start out thinking that they're going to focus on this question or this branch or this subtopic or whatever it is. And so often that just takes on a life of its own. Maybe it changes completely, but I would think in the vast majority of cases, it gets refined, at least at bare minimum, so much during the process of, if you get into a program, the coursework and the research and that sort of thing, so that what you think you're starting out examining just becomes something completely different on the other side.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah. Dr. Megan Fritts, thank you so much for the time. I have so appreciated this conversation. I really do think I just, at least again, I'm not exposed to the kinds of conversations that are happening about the difficulties and, I mean, the blessings, but also the difficulties of having a family life and also being in academia. So I appreciate you opening up on that sort of thing. If people are interested in all the kinds of things that you've been talking about, your research, the podcast, where can people find you?
They could go to my website, which is a Google site that I'll send you because I can't remember the URL for it.
I'll
You can
put
go to
in
my
the show
website,
notes.
yeah, or my Phil People account as well. My research is on there.
Okay, good. Yeah. So for people who don't know, if they go to like philpeople.org, I think it
Mm-hmm.
is, or Phil Papers, there's where you can find, I'm sure, like a lot of your research. And would love to talk to you again at some point about some specifics of that research, those papers. But at this point, I think this was great for me. So thanks again for coming on.
Awesome. Thank you so much.